Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this Seven Foundation online event. My name is Fiona Stephen, and I'm a member of the team at the Seven Foundation. I'd like to welcome our guest today, Sara Creta, who we'll introduce in just a moment, and also to thank our partners Photo Wings for their continued sponsorship of these online events. I'd like everyone, please, in the comments, please do let us know where you're joining from. We're always really interested to see where you are in the world, and we're grateful to you all for taking the time to join us today for what will be a really, really interesting discussion with Sara. So pop your name and where you are in the comments, please, so that we can have a little bit of an idea of how global our audience is today. So I'm delighted to welcome Sara to the call today. Just to provide a little bit of an overview and a welcome of Sara. Sara Creta is a documentary filmmaker, investigative journalist, and researcher working at the intersection of emerging technology and human rights. For more than a decade, her practice is focused on documenting war crimes, forced displacement, extractive economies, and systems of impunity, combining long-term field reporting with digital and forensic investigation in some of the world's most restricted conflict and border regions. In Sudan, where we'll be discussing her work today, her work has consistently challenged the traditional lens of war reporting. Her reporting from women's military camps offered a rare look at the militarization of women by Islamist groups, challenging the male-dominated narrative of conflict. Much of her recent investigative work for Channel 4 inside Ardamata, Anatomy of a Massacre, pioneers the ethical use of AI in documenting mass violence. Welcome, Sara. How are you today?
How are you? How is everyone? Thank you for inviting me again. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with you tonight. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. And for anyone who hasn't had the opportunity, Sara joined us a few months ago for Open Source Intelligence Workshop, and the recording is available through our video collection on the Seven Foundation website. So please do go back and have a little look at the extensive work available and information available through that video recording when you have the opportunity. So today's discussion explores how artificial intelligence and immersive technologies can transform visual evidence of mass violence into spaces for shared memory. This discussion centers on Sara's short film Inside Ardamata, Anatomy of a Massacre, which reconstructs the erased landscape of Ardamata, a West Darfur town where over 1,000 civilians were killed in a single day. Reporting from Sudan in 2025, Sara's movements were heavily constrained by the armed groups in control, leading her to develop new investigative methodologies, utilizing open source intelligence, survivor testimonies, and 3D modeling tools to reconstruct the atrocities of the Ardamata massacre. In this context, the very footage captured by the perpetrators as an act of domination is reframed to support the evidentiary process whilst preventing the retraumatization of victims. So a lot to discuss, Sara, today, and you're going to share some of your video work with us as well. Before we get started, if you could, you've now been working in Sudan for a number of years, and arguably the conflict there has been overlooked, particularly within Western media outlets, in favor of other conflict zones around the world. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's been happening on the ground from your perspective?
Yeah, that's true, Fiona. I've been covering the war in Sudan, but also before the war started in 2019 from Sudan. I've been able to report from the ground, and what's striking for me is that not only the lack of attention, but also the way that the conflict is framed. So definitely there is a huge lack of attention in Western media in terms of covering the situation in Sudan compared to other conflicts that are, expanding around the world. So, I mean, I don't want to do, competition over which conflicts should be reported more and so, but definitely I think in terms of like the visibility that Sudan is getting in Western media is extremely low. And that's also because, you know, there is it's very difficult to access the ground. It's very difficult to travel there, not only, you know, in Khartoum, that is, you know, relatively easier for foreign journalists to travel, but in Darfur, for example, there have been very few journalists that were able to go on the ground and to report from there. It's a logistic nightmare. It's extremely dangerous, and also, you know, the area is controlled by armed groups that are responsible of huge violations. So it's clearly one of the most dangerous place for journalists, not only for foreign journalists but also for local journalists. Um, some of my colleagues in Sudan, they keep telling me that holding a camera is more dangerous than holding a weapon, because obviously everyone is holding weapon, but, you know, not so many people are holding cameras there. And that's, you know, for me, it's enough to, yeah, to understand why this conflict has not been covered as it should. So the lack of journalists on the ground, the lack of foreign journalists able to cover the situation, but also what I was saying is, for me, what is missing is also a different frame of the war. So again, I think we are seeing over and over again the same type of gaze. It's very male dominated, it's very militia oriented, it's almost like the war is being filmed by those who are committing those crimes. And even when we are able to go on the ground, as myself in the past years, I was able to go on the ground multiple times, our movement are heavily restricted. So in a way, our gaze is restricted or is oriented or is controlled by the groups that are fighting this war. From one side, the Sudanese army, to the other side, the RSF. So both sides, they know very well why they are controlling journalism and how to use social media. And today, I think the war is also fought on social media. You know, there is a widely availability of Starlink on the ground. So armed groups are using these devices to connect, to share footages of the war, to challenge each other online, and to organize also a digital battlefield, right? So we really see how this modern conflict is evolving, right? And so for me, it's extremely interesting also to find new ways, to tell what's going on the ground, and challenging those frame, right? Again, male dominated, or famine oriented. And yeah, it's a huge humanitarian crisis, definitely, but we also need to go beyond that humanitarian frame of the war.
Mm-hmm. And I think there'll be opportunity today as we go through the discussion to also champion that there are more voices from Sudan as well. So providing a framework, as you're going to explain, a methodology that will be appropriate to share with those on the ground. So as we've spoken about before, there is a privilege of being a Western journalist in that environment, and a certain gaze that comes with that, of course, as well. So I'm sure a lot of the discussion today and some of the frameworks that you present will also provide an opportunity for those reporting on the ground in their region to find new ways of being able to utilize information and to share information to discuss what's going on, particularly, as you say, if they don't have access to a camera or if it's safe to report in that way. So thank you, Sarah. I think now is a good opportunity to bring up your slides. So I'll just bring them onto the screen.
Yeah, and this is about my recent work in Ardamata, and how I reconstruct what happened in Ardamata in November 2023. So yeah, I prepared this slide to share with you some of the methodology behind, but yeah, I'm very happy to answer your question as we go along the way. If anyone, want to send your question into the chat so we can interact.
Yes, please do. Any questions in the chat, we'll keep a hold of and we'll bring them in as appropriate. So please do feel free to add any comments in as we go through.
Yeah. Yeah, Fiona, I mean, as you were saying, I've been reporting from Sudan for several years now. And what I, for me as a conflict reporter, I mean, I work on conflict, I work in spaces that are violent spaces. In the past, I've been working in the Central Mediterranean. More recently, I work in Darfur. These two geographies are deeply connected in a way. Not only because, a lot of the people who are escaping the war in Sudan, they also cross the Mediterranean before arriving to Europe, but also because this aesthetic of war and particularly, my focus around this area in Darfur, but also in Libya, in Ethiopia. And my recent work has really, tried to look more into this aesthetic on the pictures and the visual that the perpetrator are filming. So I'm really interested in this question of truth and, how these images are shaping truth, are shaping memory, are shaping justice, and our artistic choices as filmmaker, as artist. How can we challenge the way that conflict, human rights are represented today, right? So that's why I think a lot of my work really engage with this type of idea of almost like an hybrid and collaborative form of storytelling. I try to almost use my filmmaking as a method, to create a dialogue between this aesthetic, but also the responsibility that I, want to call or interrogate in terms of also this kind of visual memory in this case, because I wanted to visualize a massacre, a place that is not existing anymore, a place that has been erased, but also, the idea that for me there must be also a political dimension beyond my work, right? So I do a lot of like research, creation based work. I finished my postdoc at the University of Copenhagen, and really those were my question, where I tried to merge my experience on the ground. And in particularly today, I think I want to focus on the idea of space, because in a way, through the work I did on Ardamata, I try to reconstruct a space that doesn't exist anymore. It's a space of war. It's a space that is contested. It's a space that is controlled. It's a space that is fragmented. And in a lot of conflict setting, we need to think about space as access to the field. It's often mediated, is often filtrated, is often negotiated, sometimes denied. And for me, this is exactly the question of power. Who can access spaces? Who can look, right? We say privileged journalist versus local journalist, from which position, right? So I think these are very important questions that we need to address before starting any project, before starting even thinking about, okay, I want to go there and film. I need to deeply position myself and try to understand where also this violence come from, right? And I feel that the idea of space and the idea of access here, it's very important, because again, a place like Sudan, access has been extremely difficult and most often denied, not only to journalists, to investigators, to humanitarian actors. Um, Many of us were just unable to reach this area. So I think in this kind of space that we need to narrate today, or we need to try to reconstruct as my work as an investigator, we need to think about, okay, if I can't go there, what can I do, right? If I can't reach that area, how can I still tell the story, right? If the space of war is fragmented, and precisely this was one of my constraints, right? I can't access that location. So how can I work, in a way that is safe and also ethically? I try to bring all this question and try to understand what's a solution, right? And for me, today, especially with the conflict in Sudan, but also with a lot of the conflict, we are witnessing violence almost at distance. So it's not just what is happening on the ground, but is how it's being shown, by whom. And this is, for me, it's the purpose, and when we think about what does it mean investigate a war that you cannot physically access, but it is presented on your phone almost daily by the algorithm. So I want to interrogate also this, in my own film practice. And I think this is very important. And this is one of the reasons, why I choose to use AI, not just to use AI to reproduce a space, but also trying to partially, if you want, escape that type of control that I had on the visual, on the gaze, right? And this is also part of the work that you do with OSINT, because you collect material, you collect fragment, you collect all these different elements, and you try to recreate almost a timeline of event or recomposing a space from all these multiple sources, right? So in a way, again, if we think about space, this is another way to access a location where we don't have access, right? So the question here that I want you to think is, how can we reconfigure that gaze? How can we question that control? How the image that the perpetrator is filming and uploading it, and we are getting that in our feed, how can we at least partially reproduce it, but without the gaze of the perpetrator, right? Without reproducing the gaze of the perpetrator. And yeah, so my work in this case really started with a concrete situation. There was a massacre that happened in Ardamata in West Darfur, and I was not able to access the site. It was impossible. But also the place was destroyed. So it was not just inaccessible, it was also destroyed. So either way, I could access this place, but it would be too late. Anything I would record would not be, the same that, it would be the aftermath of the massacre, right? So it will not be the same. I will not be able to speak with survivors. I will not be able, to record what was happening as the event unfolds. So I see this distance between the time that we can access the field and the time that event happened. Unfortunately, this is like our daily struggle today when we want to cover conflict around the world. Look at Iran, for example, look at Gaza. Like, it's almost impossible for foreign journalists to reach this location, and for local journalists is extremely dangerous as well, right? So what's left, what's remain for us to continue to do our work? And that's exactly how I started. So this is the film that I think you got the link, and you can watch it. Here the idea was, maybe we can also share it in the chat later, so for those who haven't received it and maybe they want to watch it again. The idea with this film was really like to build something that I called forensic immersive. So I wanted not only to document, but to reconstruct what was happening on the ground. So yes, I used footage that were filmed by the perpetrator during this massacre in Darfur, but I also wanted to understand the life of a war image, their circulation, their appropriation, their power, how these videos that, again, they were originally filmed by this militia, that they were filmed with this idea of committing a crime and dominating others. And obviously, when you meet survivors in exile that escape and you confront them with this type of memory, is also very, very difficult. And for survivor, to go through their testimonies and to look at this fragment from the past. So in a way, I also wanted to interrogate survivor and how this type of material that we are using in open source investigation, so the image that are filmed by the perpetrator, how survivor perceive this, how the gaze of survivor can reclaim image that are produced by the perpetrator, right? So for me, it was really key to understand the survivor perspective over these images. And I started to interrogate this image, almost like they were unfolding on the ground. I started to receive this because I was in contact with some lawyers that were already archiving this type of material, but also because the social media and the platform were offering a venue to perpetrators to share their crimes. So they were live on TikTok or Facebook, and they were filming their crime and posting it. So I started to, look at this material, receive this material, from my safe house in Paris. I started to archive this material, and I started to question, also this image, how, across the world, press freedom is shrinking. I can't go there. I can't film. I will never be allowed to go on the ground and to work on the ground because the place is extremely controlled. But then, how can I use this material? So this is really when OSINT come in place, and we spoke a lot about OSINT in our previous event.
Yeah.
And I think we can share again that with the audience if they want to go back and look at it. It was very interesting conversation around how use OSINT in your investigation and how to integrate OSINT in your investigative practice.
And Sarah, just for the benefit of anyone on the call who's unfamiliar with OSINT, can you just provide us with a little bit of context? I mean, what is open source intelligence, and how has this become, well, you've explained, of course, through such heavy restriction that it's become a necessity, but how has this informed your methodology? How's it evolved your methodology in recent years?
Yeah, so for me, it's really like about when access is blocked, but evidence still exists, how can we continue to do our work? And I can give you plenty of example where traditional access is either impossible or it is extremely controlled, but still we need to find ways that we can use other methodology to continue reporting. And that's why I think OSINT come in a very interesting moment in the world, where we have Gaza, where we have Sudan, when we have Libya, Iran, all these places. I mean, images are becoming a battlefield, and every side that is involved in the war is controlling the narrative. So we know that there is a huge circulation of proofs that can be collected, verified, but also that there is a huge potential of disinformation, and different narratives are played. Because each side in the war is trying to control the narrative. So again, I think open source, it's a very interesting tool, but it's not just technical. Today is also about how can we use open source while still navigating this contested visibility. And I think that's key for us to understand, because that's really about asking what can be verified, what is this being staged or not? Is this being recycled? Maybe what is missing, right? So I think open source really emerged in that tension, and it's not just about transforming a fragment, a video, a picture into an evidence. It's also a methodology that I think require really step-by-step almost approach. It's method, it's verification, it's corroboration, it's trying to preserve this material before it's too late, because again, we can't trust platform. It's about ethical framing, it's also about security awareness. So yeah, there is a lot to to unpack here, but I work on a handbook for Al Jazeera for people that are starting with OSINT. So it's a very basic handbook for for any one of you who's interested. And yeah, I'm also here to answer any of your questions if you have.
Yeah, please do put any questions in the chat with regards open source intelligence. It's become inherent now, hasn't it, to the verification process across all the media. So this is not something we're talking about in isolation. This is actually really a critical means of verification that all news agencies and journalists are starting to adapt to and utilize more so in their work. So please, if you have any questions, do pop them in the chat as we go through. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, and also this is connected to this film because the project really begins with this fragmented image that I start to receive and found online. So here, a few of them on the screen. These are video filmed by the perpetrator. These are like some of my field footage. These are really like scattered trace of the violence that was unfolding in Ardamata. And yeah, this started to circulate in November 2023. The first video that I received was really brutal, was less than a minute long. You had 5 men standing on against a wall and their hands raised. They were barefoot in sand and they were executed on camera. The person filming was one of the perpetrator and was shouting, "This is your destiny." And then he opens the fire. This is the first footage that I receive. And, the first question, I watched the footage over and over again. It was more than a minute 45 long. And, it was not an isolated video. I found dozens of those. They were captured, they were circulated, and they were often filmed by the perpetrator themselves. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Reed Pan. It's a filmmaker that he adopted a similar gesture. Is using absence and reconstruction to interrogate the memory of genocide and the representation on something that is unrepresentable.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, in my case, here I was working with a similar tension, but here the images were not missing. I had plenty, right? But they were coming from the gaze of the perpetrator. And so I was confronted with this idea of this image have been filmed with an intention. And this gesture of, domination, humiliation, I wanted to invert that gesture. How can I transform this image of power, into a space of memory? How do I reclaim a gaze that is being designed to humiliate, to erase? And I think this is key and central when we work with image of violence. And this is also key and central when we work with community that have been affected by this very violence. And this is, for me, is that ethical aspect that we need to integrate in our filmmaking and in our also investigative approach. Because myself, for so long, I've been using this type of imagery in my documentaries, in my investigations. And I started to question survivors and how do you perceive this, right? Is this re-traumatizing you when you watch it, when you read it, because again, we can do our work in silos. So, we can do our work only by extracting knowledge or information from communities, we need to think about how we can integrate a practice that is taking care also of communities, that is useful for community that are seeking justice, that are, being erased or being forced out of their land. So I think it's very important when we do any type of work that is, touching upon this, to keep in consideration that we need to base our practice into a survivor-centered approach that is taking care of the survivor, first and foremost, and then,
Yeah, you've been charged with a great responsibility there, actually, to switch the balance of power from the perpetrator to giving agency to the survivor in this situation. And that's an enormous challenge when you're not able to access the area, you were not present. These are not your memories, nor are the videos actually representative of the lived experience or memories of the survivors either. So it's a very complicated situation to try and ethically represent and accurately represent. So I know you're going to shortly share some of the video content and talk a little bit about the aesthetic approach, and it'd be interesting to hear, the perspective of the survivors as well. And you mentioned obviously retraumatization, how the aesthetic approach of this also supported the survivor and prevented that retraumatization. So we'll look forward to that.
I think, Fiona, that was a central tension in the project. Again, because the material I start from was produced by perpetrators. So these images were designed with a specific intent. So the question here was really like, how can I work with those images without reproducing that violence? And that for me, that's for me is when agency come through, this process of reframing, reorienting, reappropriate, the gaze. And that's why I started to, this work by placing survivor at the center. And so for me, the image, they were no longer the primary narrative of the film, but they were questioned. Sometimes, they were contradicted by a lived memory. So in a way, I wanted to find an aesthetic that was able to represent that scattered memory of the survivor. So I wanted to break that original intention of the footage. We were saying, like, this video were filmed as a trophy, as a tool of power. And, by reappropriating the gaze, I try to fragment them. I try to, place them in different spatial and narrative contexts. I wanted to interrupt that very function. And I think this is also where reconstruction, and the aesthetic of it started to shape that dialogue. I think it was amazing the work I was able to do with the communities, with the survivors, with researchers, with Sudanese that brought different perspective. I work with a group of Sudanese that were like artists, and also while we were watching this footage, we started to question, how art can also, be collective process with community, in terms of storytelling, in terms of history making. So really, I think the reconstruction was shaped by this dialogue. So it's not just about a forensic reconstruction of a place, it's also a dialogue with community that are shaping this discussion. And that's really where agency comes, I think. And it's how the image is reread, resituate, rechallenge, and in that sense, I think the work is less than, giving a voice, but is more about creating the condition for that voice to reemerge, with that hostile material, with that violent material. And that's exactly, the way that I think we should continue working with communities, with activists, with lawyers, with the people that are also in the field of art, but that they bring that perspective of, situated community that have experienced the violence or the, some of these crimes as well, right? So I think it's really, really important to bring that. And that's how, the aesthetic I choose for the film has been influenced, by this discussion.
Absolutely. And I think as well, we've spoken previously about desensitization to graphic imagery. We're all very accustomed, unfortunately, to seeing these sorts of things. And so this aesthetic approach that you've taken, which we'll see in a moment, do you feel that more immersive aesthetic that you've created sort of supports the audience's engagement and emotional response to the events?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I mean, I don't think we are necessarily desensitized, but I think we are almost overexposed in a way. Because, yes, violence is reaching us almost everywhere on our, feed, again, in our Instagrams or online. We encounter violence almost, at least in my feed. I'm not sure, because I'm assume because of the work I do, also my algorithm is changed, and obviously I have a different algorithm than you have or people in the audience will have. So my algorithm today, it's really a lot about what I do research about, right? And in my algorithm, unfortunately, but also because of the nature of my work, that repetition is there, right? And somehow I started to feel that there is a type of distance that I create as well with this material, right? Because I need to be able to understand this material. I need to be able to, look at this material for the work I do, right? So I think the question I ask myself, right, because I do this work with this type of footages, is also not like how to show more violence, but how do we reframe this condition of seeing? How, the immersive approach can be part of that. How, by reconstructing a space, by slowing down the perception, by allowing the viewer to have a more, immersive environment rather than just consuming an image, how can I shift the shock, of that audience from, bring them closer, kind of create engage kind of less immediate, maybe more situated kind of engagement. And I think more importantly, I wanted to, create a kind of context as well, for them to understand, for them to connect. So I didn't wanted to, intensify the emotion to create a kind of spectacle, but I wanted to restore a former perception that, exactly that idea of fragmented memory in the survivors, and how the image was fragmented because the survivor themselves, they couldn't remember all the event, right? They were, trying to also forget because that violent event was painful. So in a way, yes, there is the idea to carefully think about not re-traumatizing survivors, but there is also an idea of how we do position ourselves within the audience that we are trying to, to reach. And this is, I think, it's very important for us working with this type of material today, right? And that's where, the use of AI and what, I call this as a forensic approach. But I think, because obviously I come from a investigative school of like journalism, and my work really emerged from these elements, right? So here what I look at is situating the survivor testimony, trying to gelocate the events, try to understand this material not as just the sources, but also as a geography. So that's why I talk about the geography of evidence. My work really starts with survivors. So I, sit with survivors for hours to do like long interviews. I almost like spend days with survivors. I would go back again and again, like when they fail to as well. So, sometimes you will just meet one of the survivor, but they are not willing to, speak about the event. So you have to respect also that, right? And it took really, like, I think a lot of my work, it's really to try to find the best way to approach survivors and how to, work with survivor in a way that is not re-traumatizing, and, trying to, sit with community leaders, sit with lawyers that are part of the communities. So it's really, really like a long-term type of, investigative filmmaking. It's not like news, that I will go there and ask a few questions and leave, but it's a really a long-term relationship. um, I would go back, after a few months, and, we keep in touch. And it's really like how, we can work with survivors on a longer term. And this is how the work starts, right? So in a way, I have this relationship with survivors, but then I also have the video that were filmed by the perpetrators. I use satellite imagery, to try to reconstruct that space. I need to reconstruct also the event, right? And then on a later stage, I was able to go on the ground and to film the very location where these events happen. But obviously, the geography was different, right? I face a completely different space, so different from the footages, right? And that's exactly where I think the volumetric 3D model come into this process, you know, how the 3D model emerged as a way to bring that memory that somehow resisted, but it was still very fragile but persistent in the survivor, right? And yeah, maybe we can show a short clip, so for you to have an idea.
عندما مشينا الكوبري لقينا طبعا مجموعة كبير ناس مجروحين راقدين قاعدين، وفي ناس دقوم من التعذيب برضه كان قاعدين. فكل ما دقيقتين بيجوا ناس بيلمون معنا، كل دقيقتين بيجوا يلموا معنا، يعني عددية كان زادت ما شاء الله. فعندما كنا في الكوبري برضو أي زول عنده انتقام أخوه مات يا أخي جاي يصفي هنا. ده مسالة أي صفوم، ده الكمر أي صفوم، يعني ألفاظهم كله شنو؟ كعبة. ده الشباب ده كلهم معروفين يعني أنا شخصيا، وده قمر أخوي ذاته، وده فايز أخوي برضه. الكويس معك بحاول برفعك بشيلك ويقول لك أرح نوديني نوريك الزول تاني، وبعد كله هم بيرفضوا ويقول لي دي المجار منين يصفون بس الليلة ده هنا. يلا الإحساس في الزمن ده أول زول خلاص يعني بيقنع من حياته إنه هو ميت لأنه قدامك كاتلين زول، هسه قدامك ده ميت. والثاني ده بينزل دم هنا قدامك وما في زول بيسقف، تتوقع انت ذاتك مين؟
ناس مدفونين هنا. الثاني جه بفوق داز الناس زي ده، جا جريدل قام فتح المحل ده، فتح كده الناس كله لزام ده قبام جوا هنا، كمية بتاع ناس لزا قفلوا. خلاص ده النهاية.
Sarah, thank you so much for sharing that short clip. And I've put into the comments the link to the full video, so I encourage everyone to take a moment to obviously go and watch the full piece. It's an extremely compelling piece of footage, and very much places the survivors at the center and their devastating accounts of what took place that day. What was their response? I mean, you mentioned that you speak about obviously this the relationship building and how important that was to the process, and working with the communities and placing that agency and ownership back with them. What has their response been to this body of work?
Yeah, so that was, I think, the most interesting part, because as I was, trying to define the best approach and how to, integrate AI into this, toolbox basically of reconstruction, I was in constant discussion with survivors and with lawyers, that were also involved into the process. So from the moment I started to interview survivors to the moment that the film was, in the editing room, and at the end, I was almost every day in touch with the lawyers and with the people on the ground. And they were surprised to see the result. They were extremely interested in knowing, which type of tool, how I could do that, and that was also extremely interesting because it was a way for us to look at the material again. So that's where AI, I think, was extremely powerful, and the way that I integrated AI was almost like to find the distance from this footage for me, for the team that work into this project, but also for the survivors, because we started to, look at each fragment and reconstruct, every single scene, with so forensic details that, for example, that scene that you just watched on the bridge, we almost like recompose all the different pieces that, were on that bridge. And we did that using Gaussian splatting, but also with Unreal Engine. So Unreal Engine is a program that you normally use in video gaming, and how you basically rebuild environments for gaming, right? I work with a French studio that helped to, reassemble all this, fragment. And, that's where we work together on the 3D reconstruction, because I wanted that space not like to look just as it could look, right? That place needed to look exactly the same, as the real footage, right? So again, I think that was one of the most challenging part of the project, because obviously when you integrate AI and when you use AI in investigative journalism and in a setting like this, you want to make sure that, exactly how you are experiencing that place and that location, would look extremely as that place. So in a way, my biggest challenge was, how can I control the AI, right? How can I make sure, that the AI would not recreate something that doesn't exist, right? Because AI, I think, especially in visual reconstruction, raises fundamental question about truth, about representation. And, one of my concern was that the reconstruction can be mistaken, or, the simulation would produce something that doesn't look real, and, it would generate something that, there is always a risk of misinterpretation. And, some also critics would say, you don't need to use AI because the footage are already there. And, why are you integrating AI, into this process? Are you trying to, change the reality, right? And I think there is always a risk of misinterpretation. And that's why I think transparency is very important, in terms of how do I create this, which process do I, follow. I work on a production journal, and I almost like step by step, we kept, which program did we use, which attempt we did, how it failed. Okay, we didn't want to use that for that reason, right? So that's, I think, very important in my work, is to be able to, keep track of all the different steps. And, if you're asking me to have a look at that journal, for me, transparency is essential, right? I want to make that process visible, because maybe there are other investigators that they want to use that, and also, to show that what we are seeing is, is partial, obviously, right? And I think also another critics was about the aestheticization, as you were saying. some people will think that by doing this, we risk to making violence more compelling in a way, right? And I think that's something I take very seriously, because here is not to, do like something, like to transform something in something beautiful, right? Or dramatize, but it's really to create a space where the violence can be understood differently, without reproducing that spectacle. And yeah, so for me actually was the opposite, right? I don't think the AI replaced the investigation here, but really it depends on it almost, right? Yeah.
And this methodology, I mean, what were the limitations potentially that you've faced? Obviously from a technical perspective, but beyond that as well. And I mean, I'm curious to know as well. This appears, at least from a layperson's perspective, to be something that might be quite costly. Is that the case? You've worked with quite a large team on this. What were the challenges from that point of view?
Yeah, I think one of the first challenges was to visually represent the idea that I had in mind, and to convince, in this case, editors at Channel 4 that this was a strong idea, that we could actually do it, right? And that's the challenge number one, because that no one did it before, right? So it's also something that you need to test, and you need to have the space to test the prototype and make sure that it work properly with the type of material. The material we had was also a challenge, because normally when you use this type of 3D modeling, you would have a very nice scanner that would go over New York or Paris and collect beautiful 3D footages of the location, right? So you don't even need to reconstruct a space, because you already have Google Street View that show you exactly that same location. But again, here we touch upon the inequality of these tools, and how places in the global south are forgotten and ignored, because the tools are not available. So there is no way that place in Sudan could be scanned by a leader scanner, at least not a place that is controlled by armed group. I think there were some initiative to use scanner in certain in part of Khartoum before the war, but now with the war and use of drone, for example, in the war has been extremely like every armed group today is using drone in Sudan. So yeah, there is no way I could bring a drone and start scanning this neighborhood, right? So I think it was interesting for me to also think out of the box. I can't bring a scanner on this location, so I can scan these places as I would normally do. So what can I do? How can I transform this photogrammetry and 3D modeling? How can I work with the image I have to reconstruct those places? And that's also the challenge, because the fragment that we had were so fragmented. Some were really high resolution, others were lower resolution. So it was also a challenge for us, for the team, to try to find the best tool that could work with this type of footage. And obviously the budget, like, this is really a low budget project in a way. With the bigger budget, we could have done much more in terms of the animation and the way that we use also 3D in time of reconstruction. So yeah, that's also another, I think, challenge. When you don't have a big budget, how can you also start and do what you want to do, right? Because I wanted to do a longer version, but we didn't have the budget for a longer version, right? So I had to work on a smaller version. So yeah, that was interesting for me, but also was a challenge, because I'm not a 3D blender person. Like I don't come from that school, so I had also to learn these tools, because I wanted to understand what was the availability that I had in Unreal, right? So I took like a crash course on Unreal, and it was extremely challenging because I never worked on Unreal before, right? So, but I wanted to understand what were the possibility there, right? Which type of, system I could use, which type of animation I could use, what that animation would create, and so on, right? So in a way, I wanted to be in control of the process and also understand the limitation to try to find, solution that would be ethical and acceptable within that.
Yeah, that's actually really pertinent that you mentioned that, because we have a question in the chat that I'm just bring up just now from Louis. Could you go a little deeper into the advantages of using AI instead of just building the model in Blender or Unreal, although I think by hand, which I think you've just been discussing. We'd be interested in hearing more about that reflection and debating process.
So for those of you who don't know about this, it's called Gaussian splatting. So it's a relatively new technique for reconstructing 3D spaces in cases like scanning 3D places and transforming this into images. You can do it also with your phone. Like there are some apps that allow you to, scan your room or your house and, transforming that into a 3D model, right? So it's relatively new. It's instead of building a solid fixed 3D model, it represents a space as a cloud of million of small, like this soft point. That's what we call Gaussians, right? And each point basically carries an information. It could be a position, a color, a depth, and this intersect with light and so on, right? So when we combine all of this, that's the method, and that's exactly what I was looking for at that fragmentation, that imperfect data, right? That's what was interesting for me. So normally when you would have a 3D scanning with the very powerful camera, you will not find that fragmentation because it will be extremely powerful, right? And what was interesting to me here was the imperfection of the data. That's exactly what I wanted to, create, that imperfection. Because in my case, as I was starting, from video that were filmed by perpetrator, I would extract this fragment and almost like the system was eliminating them, right? So I had to find a way to, recreate the space with what I had, those fragments. And, that when we started to think with the French studio about, okay, how can we use the camera movement, to recreate what we have that is, it's there are so many elements missing in the space, right? So how can we use the camera? And here, I took a screenshot of the Unreal Engine, and you can see like, the way that the space look like from Unreal, right? And then you will have a camera here on the corner, and that's exactly the camera that you will position inside the program, to move inside the location. So that was interesting for me, was like how we can reconstruct a scene in a spatial way, but is something more fluid, more unstable, right? So you don't see a place, you don't see a fixed object, but you move, right, through this accumulation of perspective. And that was very interesting for me. It's also representing the nature of the material, right? The material itself was fragmented and also fractured, and so I had to produce almost like a spatial place that is not existing anymore. And that's exactly the memory for me of the survivor that I was trying to navigate, question, and somehow reinterpret, right? So obviously it's almost like trying to move into spaces that no longer exist, and through the memory that are left, and those memory are very violent, right?
So I have a question, maybe a slightly controversial question perhaps, Sarah, and it's really around, the inherent anxiety of integrating AI into investigative and evidentiary processes. And there will be many journalists who who will be reticent about the idea of integrating AI because of the threat that it poses to the press in particular. Have you been met with any critique? What's the response been from your peers, perhaps, in relation to integrating AI in this way?
Yeah, I think, in terms of criticism, I think it's necessary. I think we need criticism, and absolutely, I mean, another critique I had was about the aestheticization of of this violent footages. So I think, there is always a risk of misinterpretation, and I think those critiques are valid. But also, I think, in terms of AI and integrating AI in filmmaking or investigative reporting, I think what is key here is the transparency on using it AI and why we do so, and thinking that reconstructing violence and the idea of aestheticizing violence risk making it more palpable or even visually compelling. That's a wrong idea for me also, and that's something I take seriously, right? Because again, I think the concern here is, are you trying to recreate something that doesn't exist? And I would say no, because my work is really, deeply into survivor testimony. So without the survivors, there will not be any film, right? And so I'm not trying to recreate a space that I didn't visit myself. I was able to go there and to, film on the ground. So why did you use AI, right? If you were able to go on the ground and to film, right? Because again, my gaze was control. And this film is trying to position also an idea that when we film in area that are controlled by armed group, as journalists, we can't film, freely. So again, I wanted to question that gaze, and I wanted to find a way to escape to that control, right? So that's why I think it's very important to being able to position ourselves into why are we using specific tools, and what is the benefit of it, and also if there is a critique of this type of tool, being able to transparently share the process, and why do we adapt certain tool and why we don't want to adapt others, and anyone who is willing to discuss that more or want to see the production journal, I'm happy to share it with, so that it's important that we keep, I think, a transparent relation with our audience in terms of how were you able to also to access those location, and who brought you there, those very people that committed the crimes, right? So obviously my gaze was controlled, right? And I was not able to interview survivors on the ground because of that control there. So yeah, that's why I think it's interesting to see how we can find new ways of telling these stories, right? And how can we work with local journalists, local communities, lawyers that are coming from these areas, and how can we integrate this practice, in a more ethical and responsible way of storytelling.
Absolutely. And I think that's it. This work opens up the possibility of utilizing AI in an ethical manner to bring together all of those different perspectives and communities and expertise to arguably tell a more truthful account, and certainly at least to place the agency back in the hands of the survivors, as we've discussed. We only have a few more minutes, so if there are any questions from the audience, please do make sure you put them into the chat. And Sara, I'll let you play your next video before we...
Yeah, I just wanted to play this last clip, if there are no questions. Because I think also while I was working on this film, I had this strong feeling of nature, and how nature was also a witness of the genocide and what was unfolding, almost like a witness of this history and this reality, right? And so I think was very interesting for me also to include that in the film. So how nature can also be part of a storytelling of a place that doesn't exist anymore, but the nature is taking over, right? And that was something really strong when I visited this neighborhood, how the nature was taking over the neighborhood, right? Because everyone left, and we're just the nature taking over these empty houses, right? So when I work on this clip, I really had that idea in mind of like can nature become a witness of what's unfolding, right? And you see, I basically here integrate my own footage with the reconstruction, and they almost like dissolve together. And that's exactly the idea of the memory, right? That the memory of the genocide and the way that survivors are still keeping those memories alive because they want justice one day.
Thank you, Sarah. So, oh, there we go. One
Yeah.
more
I don't know
question.
if there are any other question about the methods, or if you are still here with us, or
Oh yes, they're still here. A question for you, if you don't mind, and it's just about, I suppose, what you hope the lasting legacy or impact of this project will be, and how that might shape the future of visual storytelling. How do you perceive that? What's the next evolution of visual storytelling from your perspective?
yeah, I think we need to continue to create together with communities, and that's why I think is important, to be able to go back to, discuss with communities how do they perceive this. So I think our work never finish once the editing room, the last clip is on that editing suite and you export the film. The work continues, and the relationship with communities continues because of the trust that you build, and the way that my work is also intertwined with other struggles that are larger than just my work as a filmmaker or a journalist, right? So I think it's really like try to situate our own work, our own practice within a larger practice of justice seeking in my case, or because somehow it's also telling the history of places that have been erased with a clear intent to erase communities, to destroy the land, to control resources. So I think filmmaking in this case, but in a larger way, is not just about bringing those stories to the public and keeping those stories alive, but is also about history making, and I think it's very interesting how this can also play a role into a larger perspective of how history is being rewritten in context of conflict and in places like Sudan. And so I really hope that my work could be find a place in that perspective. And the fact that the work is being screened in festival, in schools, in places where people that want to learn more about what's happening in Sudan, or in places where people from Sudan want to speak about their own history, right, can use this work also to advocate for their rights. I think that's the direction we need to go.
Absolutely. Well, Sara, thank you so much. I have great admiration for the integrity of your approach and incorporating so many different members of the community in constructing this work. And as you say, I hope the legacy of this is that it does inspire others to work in the same manner and to provide a mechanism and a methodology for many of those within their own regions trying to tell the stories under great restriction, and that this provides some inspiration and a mechanism to do that. So thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your incredible work. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear from you. And thank you to everybody in the audience as well for joining us. I'm sure there's an awful lot to take away from that and consider. And you can reach out to Sara, of course, if there's anything further that you'd like to discuss with her. Please do go back and have a look at the previous recording of our open source intelligence workshop, which Sara contributed to a couple of months ago, which is available on the video collection on the Seven Foundation website. A big thank you again to PhotoWings, our partners, for sponsoring today's event. And we hope to see you all on our next online event. Thank you all very much. And thank you again, Sara.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.